There is skill training and remediation. Let me not make no mistake there, but that most institutions provide that through their learning skills strategists. There are some of you, anybody in the room aware of the LOTF funding, Learning Opportunities Task Force that came along? Yes, I saw what. Yes, Janice, I know. Anybody else? Yay. Okay, good. So several years ago, the province initiated the Learning Opportunities Task Force to look at services to students with learning disabilities exclusively in post-secondary education. I won't get into a long song and dance about the LOTF, but it has resulted in specific funding for assessments at the post-secondary level for LD students, learning strategists who teach all of these things, and assistive technologists to train people on hardware and software use for students with learning disabilities. Happily, for the rest of us, some of those programs have now expanded their mandate to serve other students as well. So that infusion, which some of us were a little sensitive about because there are other disabilities than LD out there, has expanded to include accessing those other students as well. So that seed has grown into an enormous service provision across the province. And every institution has a learning strategist and an assistive technologist to work with students around those issues. So currently, what happens? How do you get an IEP in university? The student has to identify themselves to the disability office, so people don't go out with a butterfly net and say, yeah, you, I want you in my office. By the way, I see you limp. Would you like to come and see me? Not happening. So when a student came to me with his mother and said, so who's going to wake my son up in the morning? I said, we're going to buy him a shake-awake alarm. And we did. And he is doing just fine without his mom waking him up, and travels the world and has served as a tour leader for us both here and at the castle in Scotland. And he didn't need his mom to wake him up. And we didn't wake him up either. So the student comes to us, they present with their issues. They say, this is the course I'm in, I need alternate format, where do I get my material in large print or braille? The third-party documentation of the disability is required, and this is where this would be another whole session, too, on medical and social models of disability in post-secondary. But we do have to have documentation because we are looking at whether students qualify for funding around bursaries, around certain services that do have a cost attached, or whether, you know, we are really the right people for them to be working with, or is there someone like a study skills strategist who would be better suited to meet their needs. So we do start with the documentation, and the documentation, I'll get to in a minute, there's a whole slide on that, but that is required, and an IEP is not documentation. Can I say that loudly enough? So you bring your documentation, you have an intake interview with staff, you look at the links that need to be made between the student and their curriculum, and you develop an individual accommodation plan. And I'm saying this a little generically because they will vary from one institution to another in post-secondary, particularly between colleges and universities. But this basic process you will find anywhere in Ontario. Then the office and the students decide who's going to do the most advocacy. So sometimes students are very autonomous. They have a lot of self-advocacy skills and they want to do this themselves. We push them out the door and say, we're here, you go for it. Other students need a little bit more support, so we may do some role-playing, some coaching around how to advocate for yourself with staff. And if necessary, the office will go out and do that as well. But I think, you know, at this stage of the student's education, we're looking more and more at how autonomous can they be and how can they learn to get their needs met. So that element will vary a little bit with the philosophy of the office and the needs of the student. But we begin to take more and more of a backseat in the advocacy until it's needed so that the student can get those skills themselves. So the documentation piece. Documentation in post-secondary has to be provided by a licensed professional with expertise in the area that they're diagnosing. So, and of course my examples are all real examples. I really don't want to hear about a psychiatric disorder from your father who's a gynecologist. Not going to fly. So not only does there have to be not a family member be your physician, but it actually has to, the expertise has to relate to the area of disability. The other thing, there has to be enough information that you can actually create an accommodation plan in that context. Because post-secondary is very different from primary and secondary, we're creating a plan that's going to be developed with very specific requirements around, as I said, practicum or professional programs, those kind of things. So we have to know enough about the problem to really create an effective approach. And a lot of times we get documentation that says, for medical students, the student requires, for medical reasons, the student requires all available supports. Well, that's really not very helpful when I'm looking at how to accommodate you in a chemistry lab. You know, all available supports. Well, on the one hand, there may be no supports available unless we know what the problem is, and if we know the problem, then we'll design some supports. So while the Commission would tell us that we can't ask for a diagnosis, a lot of times it's not helpful unless we know enough about the problem to create an effective solution. So we request that from the student. And there are two places where you can look, or your parents that you're working with can look for documentation requirements. The IDIA website has the documentation standards that universities in Ontario expect, and the LDAO also publishes documentation standards for learning disabilities, which most of the post-secondary institutions adhere to. Okay. So at that point where we're making this design for accommodation planning, these are the issues that we look at. And okay, I'm piloting this, so if you have any questions or input, please let me know because I need feedback on this puppy. Yes, there's a question out there. Oh, sorry.
Is ADHD this time recognized at the post-secondary level as a learning disability?
Yes, it is. Documentation is a hotly contested topic in ADHD. And in fact, that's a really good question because it goes back to the second bullet here, where we need to know enough about the condition and whether it's remediated or not to know if it first requires any accommodation, because some students are remediated with effective medication and life skills strategies. Other students are still not effectively helped with that and require accommodation. And a lot of times what we see in ADHD documentation is inadequate, and so we do a fuller assessment and find it's not ADHD because it is so frequently misdiagnosed with underlying mental health issues like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, medical problems that have not been related to the student, socioeconomic problems, but like it's huge. And often physicians will say, oh, yep, restless, here, have Ritalin, ADHD. Well, that doesn't tell us anything about how a student really learns, what their challenges are in one environment or another. So we're really pushing for much more thorough documentation, and a prescription pad note with ADHD on it will not do the job.
So what kind of assessment are you looking at?
We're looking at an LD-like assessment that looks at functional implications on academic tasks. Yep. Because what you want to see is how does this person's attention affect their performance on academic tasks, right? And some kids with ADHD, giving them extra time in an exam is useless because they bore a hole through that thing and they don't have the patience to sit there for 3 more hours. Never mind 4.5, right? So you really need to know what that student's attention looks like in that curriculum. And if they're in something that really slows down their reading speed and their processing speed is, you know, in the basement and their ability is really high, then yeah. Then you're looking at extra time and all the other supports. But you really need to refine and define that clearly enough to get a good accommodation plan. And I cannot tell you the appalling